So we're up to session two. And the first session was on the general background to Renaissance culture and the growth of the material universe in Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries as the backdrop to this. And this session, I want to look at the actual revival of classical humanism, what the mechanism for that was before the final four sessions, when we're going to look at things like the fallout from that, particularly in the next couple of sessions, the one on wealth and patronage and what I call the Brave New World. But to begin, in pursuit of classicism, if we go back to the beginning, the first large-scale man of importance or person of importance is Petrarca, who's entirely a 14th century figure, Trecento figure in Tuscany. And he is almost single-handedly responsible for generating among the educated elite a passion for classical Latin and its pursuit. So he becomes the center of a literary circle. That circle includes Giovanni Boccaccio, another one of the great figures of this early period. He's a poet. He's a prolific letter writer, which he actually formulates in a book called the Ars Dictamen, the art of letter writing. And he becomes a popularizer, the godfather of this resurrection of an interest in classical sources, Roman sources in particular. He's a collector of manuscripts, so he begins that great pursuit. And he's a collector of manuscripts and actually writes a piece, I mentioned it here, on the scarcity of copyists. There aren't, in this period, you're pre-printing by a century or so. And printing isn't going to really get off the ground, as we'll see, until the 16th century. And copyists were very important. And the medieval copyists in the monasteries were not copying the sources that Petrarch and Boccaccio would have wanted copied. And those would have been, for someone with classical interests, Roman writers like Cicero, and who, for Petrarch, is by far the most important literary source because of the fact that his work is comprised of letter writing and what I'll call here civic philosophy, affairs of the day. And for a Florentine living in this fledgling Republic of Florence, being able to negotiate matters of civil and civic governance and letters that are really adapted to this secular culture are of primary importance. And so Cicero, and this is what I was trying to point out last week, the change in attitude and the change in the material conditions, the political, social, and economic conditions are parallel. They take place together. When do you want to read Cicero? You want to read Cicero as the world of Cicero, the world of a public marketplace that is not medieval, that is not manorial culture. As that develops, that's when you want to go to those sources. So Renaissance, the rebirth, is really a recovery. And what I want to point out in the whole bottom of this slide, you'll see where I'm headed, that recovery is a conservative impulse. It's not innately creative in the sense that the High Middle Ages was a period of great philosophical creativity, where all the questions of a modern epistemology, modern knowledge theory, uh, modern science, modern philosophy, all the central questions, how brains work, how we know anything, all of that, the language for that, the categories for that, were invented in the late Middle Ages. This period is really about recovering a sensibility that predates that. And that is very mundane. It's very about the world of business and the world of affairs and the world of commerce. So there's this appetite for classical texts. Libraries everywhere are beginning to be combed when people can get access to them for materials that were overlooked or misplaced. Sort of, if you ever saw the film The Name of the Rose, where they get into the scriptorium to find manuscripts that seem lost but are probably there under piles of dust and on the back shelves. Abbeys, churches, and universities probably had these documents, but in the Middle Ages, there wasn't an interest in them. So let's go find them. It's a period with a tremendous interest in philology, which is the actual study of texts and the language of texts, trying to ascertain the best and indeed beyond the best, the correct version of the text. Philology is the study of the actual words themselves. How can you read a text and figure out, or a series of texts if you have many copies, and think of what monastic copyists would have introduced as errors. If someone copying from an original changed 3 words, then every subsequent copy made from those copies would include most likely those errors. And that errata would be copied and introduce new errors would be introduced along the way. And so philology is usually a matter of getting as many manuscript versions as you can, and then trying to work backwards to the source text, the ur-text. So this trail of mistakes and deviations spur a humanist conservative impulse to getting back to an original that was correct, because the god of this discourse is someone like Cicero. Let's get back to the true Cicero if we can, so that we may imitate them. Imitatio, we may remake ourselves in the grand Roman literary style, and by extension, the culture that flourished at that time, meaning the Stoic philosophy, the civic philosophy of the period. Medieval texts were considered corruptions of proper popular Latin. So as I said above, it's a conservative impulse. It's trying to get back to an original. Now, the players that follow in the next generation include, and the reason I mention with pride of place, the Chancellor of Florence in the late 14th century, Coluccio Salutati, is that he becomes a kind of uncle at the court of Florence to a host of nephews, if you will. He becomes a sponsor of study. He develops programs and schooling opportunities for language studies, for text comparisons, and an entire generation of younger humanists develop their chops at Florence in the, if you will, in the court of Coluccio Salutati, who, as I said, becomes the chancellor and is a major player in Republican politics at this point in time, sort of pre-Medici Florence. He's an eminent Latinist, He's a manuscript collector. He's the man who discovers Cicero's collection called Letters to His Friends. Among the people he sponsored, so you notice in the birth dates of the people that follow here, they are 1 to 2 generations his junior. He's almost like a grandparental figure. The first two, Poggio Bracciolini and Niccolò de Niccoli, are the two greatest collectors of Roman manuscripts into the 15th century. Poggio is a papal scribe. He works as a secretary under 7 different popes. He's a historian of the city of Florence. He's an advisor to the Medici, and he is perhaps the preeminent manuscript hunter, a rich compatriot of his and friend of his, who's older than Poggio, but they die about the same time. Niccolò has the largest humanist library, and he's the man who actually invents cursive script, what's called italic. And the reason it's called italic is because it's from Florence. And Italian, if you will, was the word given to the Florentine dialect, which was recognized throughout the rest of what we now think of as Italy as the standard bearer. So when they say italic, they're really talking about the Florentine dialect of the period, which is going to become Italian. And so italic script is named for the time and place. And the third one on the list is Leonardo Bruni, who another person who becomes Chancellor of Florence, and he writes a history of Florence that was the first so-called modern history that looks at political intrigue and economic forces and the like. He's also a biographer of Cicero, of Petrarch, and Dante, but sort of the little circle of gods for these early humanists. And he's the man who coined a term that we're going to look at in detail in a little bit called Studia Humanitatis, the study of humanity, or the essence of humanity, if you will, and from which we're going to get the whole idea of the liberal arts and the study of the humanities. This is what they regarded the Roman curriculum as, and they wanted to reconstitute it. And we get our own liberal studies as a product of this. Philology and text criticism was a major focus of activity. The study of classical Latin resulted in just this explosion of manuals on rhetoric. This is a period when people wrote many how-to collections with samples and examples. This is the way you construct a good paragraph. This is the way you construct a speech. A letter should have these following elements. And developing this ability meant that you had to develop a critical sense for how to compare texts, to determine what's good, to determine what's correct, to determine what's prior in manuscripts, which came first, which was copied from which, that sort of thing. And it's the study of linguistic structural changes over time. And the foremost representative of the early philologists was a man who became the rival of people like Poggio, the great Lorenzo Valla, who proves, and he's famous for this, he was an arrogant character, apparently, and offended almost everybody he got close to. And he takes on the entire church, even though he is also a papal scribe and secretary. He's the one who proves stylistically that the donation of Constantine is a historical forgery. Back in the early Middle Ages, following the collapse of Rome, the church was trying to establish its position as taken over the leadership of Western Christendom. And one of the ways they tried to shore up their reputation and their authority in this regard was through a document called the Donation of Constantine that said, in effect, it was Constantine, the great first Christian Roman emperor, donating his throne, if you will, to the papacy. The Pope will now be the ruler of Western Christendom. It will no longer be the emperor. Well, Valla took the document and proved from the Latin itself that it had to have been written at a later period, in the early medieval period, and not in the Latin of the time of Constantine. He takes documents that came from the court of Constantine, and he does a philological analysis, and he says, this is a historical forgery. And he's the one who then argues even further that biblical texts should be subject to literary analysis. We should do the same thing. Let's look at the Greek of the Septuagint. Let's look at the Latin of St. Jerome. Let's see if we can construct purer original texts, working backwards. So this craze for documents to submit to analysis meant that a frenzy for a century and a half, a frenzy of manuscript hunting was loosed on Western Europe. So the generation mentored by Salutati were driven by a passion to find and copy Latin texts that were known to have existed, but which had seemingly disappeared in the Middle Ages. Let's get the missing texts. It was presumed as early as the days of Petrarch and Boccaccio that monastic libraries had copies of lost texts of little interest to badly educated monks. So humanists like Poggio and Niccolo had the connections, either wealthy patrons or papal appointments, that gave them access to those monasteries. I mean, often they needed monasteries were just not letting people into their libraries and their scriptoria. So you would have needed someone backing from someone particularly important to get into these places. And it was largely the Benedictine abbeys of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries that were being rummaged through. And look at this little paragraph that I've quoted here. It's from an account written by Boccaccio, who had gotten permission to enter the library of Monte Cassino, which is along the Via Appia between Rome and Naples as you're headed south out of Rome. Quote, and found the place of such great treasure without door or key. And as he entered, he saw weeds growing through the windows and all the books and tables thick with dust. Marveling, he began to open and turn over one book after another. And he found there many different volumes of ancient and exotic works. From some of them, several pages had been removed to be scraped for psalters or missals. From others, the edges of the pages had been cut away, and thus they were mutilated in many ways. At last, he went away grieving and in tears, regretting that the toil and effort of so many famous intellects had come into the hands of such corrupt and wasteful men. So for people like Boccaccio or Poggio later on, the idea that monks would have a source document from Lucretius or from Cicero or from Seneca, and they would and since parchment, which was sheepskin, was tremendously expensive. I mean, literally, you had to take the sheep of the skin and scrape it down, and the process would take a week or two to get in the right shape and stretched properly so that you could then use it to write on. A medium, by the way, that's superior to everything since we went until the period when we went digital. that somebody would rip a page out and scrape it down again because the Cicero was not valued, the Lucretius wasn't valued, and to write psalms on it or missals for the monks to sing from. And it's all about the change in intellectual focus. What's important to these earlier monks is not important, in fact, is a desecration or responsible for a desecration in the eyes of these later folk. Now, texts found by Poggio include some of the speeches of Cicero, and the most importantly, the De Rerum Natura of Lucretius, which is a 12,000 line scientific treatment by the great first century BC writer Lucretius. And not insignificantly, the De Architectura of Vitruvius. What we know about building an aqueduct construction in the ancient world is largely from Vitruvius. And the Res Gestae of Ammianus Marcellinus, which is a history of the Goths from a Roman observer who himself was a Goth, Ammianus in the late 4th century. On occasion, Poggio had to bribe monks to smuggle out a manuscript or to let him make a copy. I'll make a donation. Let me in for a few hours. Sometimes we find out from letters, he took parts of manuscripts that he could slide up his sleeve and sneak out of the abbey with. At other times, he would tell them he was copying one thing, but he would actually be copying another, which they would not have given him access to because it was considered heretical or considered somehow decadent and corrupt. And he would have to fool them and use every kind of underhanded method to get this stuff out. It isn't just Roman and Latin texts that are in high demand by the time we get to the generations following Salutati. Classical Greek is about to have its own renaissance in the same period. So in the map on the right, you'll see the blue box is the heartland of Greek speakers. And even though, if you notice on that map, the Byzantine Empire is that little purple piece within the blue box, and this is, early 14th century. But there are Greek speakers in southern Italy, which was part of the earlier Byzantine Empire. And for instance, in Calabria, a Greek bishop named Barlaam has his own library. So there were Greek books that were close by. But Byzantium is heavily contracted. As we saw from the maps last week, Genoa and Venice had established significant inroads into the Greek world as Byzantium itself was weakened. But in the Middle Ages, earlier on, the only contact with Greek culture was in translation. And those translations were found in Spain. So although there may have been Greek books nearby, the knowledge of Greek itself had pretty much evaporated in the West. Earlier on in the 7th and 18th century, a couple of the Irish monasteries still had some Greek translators around. But I think by the 9th century, that was the end of that. So if you wanted to get your hands on really the core documents, remember, Roman literature itself knew that it was secondary to the great corpus of science, medical, and philosophical and artistic, like tragedy writing, literature of the Greek world. They knew they were the poor sister, the poor brother. And so this was still a source of great interest in the West, but in the, as I explained in the bottom, it had all gone from Greek into Arabic because of two steps, which you've heard me mention in other settings, quite detailed explanations of, that the Greek in the 8th and 9th centuries in Baghdad, the Greek, often in a two-step translation, made it into Arabic from Greek to Syriac, a language spoken by Christians in the Levant, Syrian Christians, and Christians in the Fertile Crescent in Iraq. They would translate from Greek to Syriac, and then others from Syriac to Arabic. And then in the 12th and 13th centuries in Toledo and Granada and other places in Spain, but very particularly in Toledo, a two-step translation from Arabic to Andalusi Romance, as they call it, one of the many pre-Spanish Romance languages that you find in Spain in the 12th and 13th centuries, and then eventually into Latin, translated by church people who had come down into Spain and gotten help from Arabic scholars and Jewish scholars who were fluent in Arabic to get the first step of the translation done. These documents, as you can imagine, having moved through half a dozen languages, were very corrupt in the sense that many mistakes had been introduced, or many misreadings had been introduced from the original, since the original Greek. And now these philologists, these humanists, with their text consciousness and their new techniques, who realized that those translations that they had out of Arabic were deeply flawed, they wanted to return to the original text and start over. Let's get the original Plato. Let's get the original Aristotle. Let's get the original Euclid. Let's get the original Ptolemy and go from there. So they were in search of two things: the actual Greek books, A, and B, people who could teach them sophisticated literary Greek to read those documents. Because you have to understand, the Greek spoken in Byzantium in the 13th century and the 14th century was a far cry. It was a lot closer to modern Greek and a far cry away from classical Greek. So you didn't just need Greek speakers, which any Venetian merchant traveling, to make sales someplace in the Near East would have been able to bring back 47 people who could speak kitchen Greek of one kind or another. You needed Greek scholars from the Greek world who themselves were astute students of classical Greek. And these were hard to come by. Then out of the blue, when Salutati is still holding his court school in Florence, a diplomat who had led an embassy from the Byzantine emperor to Venice for help against the Turks. And it begins as early as the 1380s and 90s, and this will go on for the next 50 years. They're constantly sending Greek representatives to the West. Please help us, help your fellow Christians in our titanic struggle against the Ottoman Empire. A man named Manuel Chrysoloras stays in Venice and begins classes in Greek for a small circle of humanists. He's a good Latinist, so he can speak Latin with the Westerners. And he comes to Venice, and later on he goes to Florence, and he goes all over Italy. He returns to Constantinople when he does go back after he stays in Italy for a while, with two Italian humanists Giacomo da Scarperia and a very significant man, Guarino da Verona, who are students of Salutati who agree to go back to Constantinople to learn Greek in depth and to come back with Greek manuscripts and a mastery of Greek so that they can start teaching Greek to the Italians. Chrysoloras had classes for a while, but he doesn't really stay around long enough. So humanists with theological interests in this period, like Ambrogio Traversari, who becomes the prior general, that's the equivalent of the abbot of the Camaldolese order, and a guy I'll talk about a little more later, Aeneas Silvio Piccolomini, who becomes Pope Pius II, are students in this world. And I focus on them to introduce the idea, which we'll be talking about extensively in a couple of sessions later than this one, is the fact that religious, if you try to build a thumbnail reductionist picture of the Renaissance as interests shifting from the sacred to the profane, to the secular, to the human, away from the divine and the like. I want to point out it's a much more complicated world than that. And that some of the leading humanists are popes, are the head of major Benedictine orders, like the Camaldolese, are major theological figures in the Protestant Catholic battles that will take place in the early 16th century. So people like Thomas More and people like Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam are themselves tremendously fluent, educated humanists who themselves are deeply religious people. And if you looked at this period through the eyes of religious devotion, you would say our great Reformation, Protestant Reformation figures. These layers can exist coterminously. Anyhow, on Salutati's invitation, Chrysoloras comes to Florence for 3 years. Later on, he goes to Bologna, goes to Venice, goes to Rome. He teaches elementary to advanced Greek classes. He writes a grammar, which becomes called the erotemata, questions, that actually later on goes into print when they start the presses going. And it becomes up through the 16th century the standard text for studying ancient Greek. As a teacher, he is immensely influential. He's a kind of a cult. All the humanist figures who ever were in touch with him speak of him as if he was the great teacher of their lives. He must have had a profound influence on a couple of generations of humanist scholars. And I include this picture of Raphael's, this fresco from Rome of Raphael's School of Athens with all the Greek philosophers, because the interest in them, Raphael probably did this around the year 1500, somewhere around there. The interest in Greek things, the interest in Greek culture, the interest in classical figures in this period will inform the artwork of the period, not just the literary study of the period. Will be, we'll look at some graphical representations at the end of today, that to create the sense of how focused on the ancient world, how far beyond just narrow biblical scenes and biblical studies the humanist world was. So there is a gold rush for Greek texts, and the texts start coming to the West. So in 1438, so now you're, some almost a half century after the appearance of Manuel Chrysoloras, another delegation of Greeks came to a council. It's called the Council of Ferrara in Florence. It took place in both places with the stated purpose of healing the Catholic Orthodox schism. But the ulterior motive is enlisting Latin aid to fight the Ottomans. And in this delegation, a Greek named Bessarion, who becomes a major figure, who's entirely a Quattrocento or 15th century figure. He's a Greek scholar. He's a philosopher, a Platonist. He's fluent in Latin, and that's one of the reasons he's in the delegation. And remember, if you're going to be cosmopolitan in Europe or in the Near East, Greek and Latin are going to be the languages. Languages like Italian and French and Spanish don't really exist. Dialectical versions of them exist. I'm sure someone from Genoa and someone from Venice, if they didn't know already each other's dialects, would have great trouble communicating. Tuscan was beginning to catch on because of Dante and because of Boccaccio as a kind of vernacular that they could all aspire to. But certainly someone coming from the Greek world would not be speaking that. They would have had to communicate in Latin. And in a letter to a patron, the humanist Ambrogio Traversari, the man who's the head of the Camaldolese order, I've become intimately familiar with the Archbishop of Nicaea, that's Bessarion, a man of singular erudition and merit, and I wish to press him for information about books. Here's this delegation asking for aid, military aid, and religious resolution of theological impasses. But here is the head of the Camaldolese order saying, but my interest is getting books out of this guy. I heard that he brought little with him, but left behind a great collection of books. I proceeded, nevertheless, to ask him, and he said that he left behind 2 large volumes of Strabo. These are rare. I was sorely vexed that he did not bring them, but it was necessary to dissemble. I couldn't let on that I was really pissed off that he hadn't brought these. Still, I hope to collect them should this appeal to him, and I would like in return to receive a share for myself. That means something I can do copies from. He has a large volume of Cyril, St. Cyril against Julian the Apostate, a great early Roman saints, Christians' response to the Emperor Julian the Apostate, an emperor in the 4th century who, after Constantine, tries to reestablish paganism in Rome, which we will take to transcribe if we can find the parchment. I learned that he has many books on mathematics, Euclid and Ptolemy, written in his own hand with the most useful diagrams. Oh, if I could only get my hands on those. After 1439, Bessarion, who now stays in the West and becomes a cardinal, established a haven for Greek expatriates in Rome that became a center for collecting and translating Greek texts. So basically in 15th century Eastern Mediterranean, there's a brain drain from Constantinople to Florence, where wealthy patrons like the Medici can display their newest toys, rare manuscripts, and the new learning. And they can step up and provide the money, the patronage to attract the right people to the court. Then Bessarion makes a donation of his entire library, and he does it to Venice, of all places, which is not his home, and it's not where he's living or staying. So in 1468, by this point, It's 15 years after the fall of Constantinople. Bessarion has donated his collection of 482. This doesn't sound a lot to us in the age of print, but 482 Greek and 264 Latin codices to the Republic of Venice, which this was a hall of the largest scale, stipulating that a public library be established to ensure their conservation for future generations and availability for scholars. And he explains why he sent them to Venice. I could not select a place more suitable and convenient to men of my own Greek background. Though nations from almost all over the earth flock in vast numbers to your city, the Greeks are most numerous of all, as they sail in from their own regions. They make their first landfall in Venice and have such a tie with you that when they put into your city, they feel they are entering another Byzantium. And certainly in that procession image in San Marco, with the great Basilica of San Marco in the background, you're looking at a church that could easily have been built in the middle of Constantinople. So I have given and granted all my books, both in Latin and Greek, to the most holy shrine of the Blessed Mark, St. Mark. Allegedly, the bones of St. Mark were smuggled out of, I think, Cairo and in the legend and brought to Venice. Your glorious city, sure in the knowledge that this is a duty owed to your generosity, to my gratitude, and to the country which you wanted me to share. So Venice has a special place in the hearts of Greek emigrants into Italy in the 15th century. And I make this little note on the bottom of the page. Just as with Crivelli's Annunciation, which we talked about last week, collections of luxury items attest to the power and prestige of a city. And if I expand the view here, this is, I think, by Bellini, actually. This procession is itself an attempt at showing off the glory and power and significance of the city of Venice. So very much as Crivelli did with Ascoli Piceno, we have Bellini doing this with Venezia. The study of humanities, the Studio Humanitatis, which is actually an educational program, study of man, study of humanity, the humanities. So medieval higher ed, what they called scholasticism, now is being regarded as narrow pedantry. It's largely philosophical subject matter, was taught with a very formal methodology and strict rules. Logical deduction and dialectical argument were its primary methods. Nothing that would be used in common Roman discourse or commercial discourse. The humanist curriculum is based on their reading of the Roman curriculum. The civic focus of Roman life became the objective of humanist education, to try to create the citizen of the new republic, the rounded person, the Renaissance man, if you will. The ethical and political development of the ideal citizen is a goal. Individual virtue and prudence, what we would call self-development, takes on a secular dimension. You're not making yourself the perfect servant of the Lord. You're making yourself the best citizen of the republic, the best me that I can be, if you will. Grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, moral philosophy, these are the studies required to create the ideal person, the ideal citizen. And the ideal is epitomized in the Italian word virtù, which means virtue or power, but it's a term that has a strong secular cast and a connotation very different from that of Christian virtue. That is, by the way, Patty chatted, I believe the procession was a painting of the True Cross fragment being brought back from the Holy Land. That is what the topic was, which was just another show of power. Anyhow, but this virtu is the virtu of the proud, the person who has made herself or made himself a significant, rounded, curated work of art. I've completed myself. I have become a significant person in the republic of the world I'm in. So it's got an ethical and political force, a secular force. And so the ethical and political focus of the curriculum had a profound shift on which writers and which books were now relevant. Medieval philosophy had a dialectical and metaphysical bent, with Aristotle as the leading light. Now, the Roman interest is in civic-minded philosophy, particularly Plato and the Stoics. And they're the ones who became essential reading. Epic and lyric poetry, regarded as decadent by the medieval mind because it was superficial to them. Oh, it's mere art. What, mere poetry? And we're trying to discuss significant matters here. Becomes indispensable to the well-rounded worldly ideal. And so the new books are going to be in the arena of politics and letters. Cicero, Polybius, Seneca, Pliny the Younger, the historians, Tacitus, Plutarch, Polybius, rhetoric and education, Quintilian, Cicero, poetry, Virgil, Catullus, Ovid. We have a whole new set of books on the shelf. And now the other books are not going to be as read. And the balance is going to shift. The pendulum is going to swing. The innovators in educational technique, the two most famous, Niccolo Guarino da Verona, he's a Greek scholar. He's an early student of Chrysoloras, and he becomes the central teacher of Studia Humanitatis at Ferrara at the court of the Este family. He's a mentor of Leonello d'Este, and we're going to hear more about that relationship at some later point. And another same generation, precisely, a major educational figure is Vittorino da Feltre, and his picture, his real last name is Ramboldoni, but you were often in this period called by the place you were from. So Guarino's da Verona and Vittorino is da Feltre. He is a court teacher at Mantova, the Gonzaga court. He's the creator of the first secular boarding school, implementing the best of humanist pedagogical principles, which we would call progressive education. Originally, that school was called La Casa Gioiosa, the House of Joy, and Vittorino renames it very tellingly, La Casa Giocosa, the House of Play. So instead of being heavy and burdensome, we are going to create educational techniques that invite the child within to joy, to enrichment, to fulfillment, to their best self, so they can achieve virtu and become Renaissance men. Noble families from all over Italy send their children to Vittorino's School of Princes. In fact, Guarino sends his son, Battista, to Vittorino's school to study. So the Renaissance ideal is based on the Roman model of Stoic self-realization to educate the whole person intellectually, morally, physically. Stoic civic responsibility to the republic or to one city, is a primary goal to educate the responsible and capable citizen or prince. And so Machiavelli is going to be part of this tradition in another generation or so. So that whole sensibility that we think of as characterizing the Renaissance elite was really based on Roman models that they just recovered from the texts that they were unearthing and as the lost texts of the monasteries. The Roman model derived of education, which we have a most complete sense of from the writings of Quintilian, a Roman writer of the first century AD, or Common Era, embraces grammar and rhetorical study, which is the basis of the trivium. The liberal arts are the group of three and the group of four. The trivium were the literary studies, grammar, rhetoric, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium of the liberal arts were the four, if you will, mathematical, even though they include music, astronomy, mathematics, music, etc. The highest literary study was rhetoric, how to speak and present and influence in the marketplace that is the Republic. The 5 canons of rhetoric, according to Quintilian. And this would have been taught in all the handbooks in all the courts of the Renaissance. Inventio, developing and refining your arguments. Dispositio, arranging and organizing your arguments for maximum impact. Can you not hear English Composition 101 reflected in this? Allocutio, style, the process of determining how you present your arguments using figures of speech and other rhetorical techniques. Memoria, memory, memorizing your speech. I'm going to have more on this. So you can deliver it without the use of notes, including the storing up of famous quotes, literary references, and other facts that could be used in impromptu speeches. So as in Roman studies, Renaissance students would keep notebooks, and we'll talk about the notebook technique in a bit, where students were encouraged to write down images and anecdotes that strike their fancy as significant, as colorful, as persuasive, as useful, and to be able to pop them out extemporaneously when making the good speech. Having that thing you can draw on that becomes totally apt to the moment, totally fitting the circumstance and moving the audience. Memory and memorization was an important precondition to all learning in the Renaissance, as it was in the Roman period. The Muses, the 9 goddesses of the arts, were all the children of memory. Mnemosyne is the mother of the Muses in the classical Greek world. Patty pointed out Muslims are still expected to memorize the Quran, and Talmudists are expected to memorize huge chunks of Talmud the same way. And then, of course, axio, the delivery, the process of practicing how you deliver your speech, gestures, pronunciation, tone of voice. We have acting classes. Anybody take any speech classes in college where you were asked to present something effectively? Well, this is the core of the literary curriculum in Rome and the literary curriculum in the Renaissance schools. Medieval miscellanies, collections and anthologies in handbook form on a range of topics. Political or civil rhetoric was not a common subject, but there would be best practice examples in the Middle Ages. And so they adopted medieval miscellanies as a way to pile up ideas for the new way of thinking about the world. Now, a slide about the so-called art of memory, a famous book on this called The Art of Memory, written by a woman named Frances Yates in the early 20th century. That is one of the magisterial cultural studies of the ancient, an aspect of the ancient world and the medieval world and the Renaissance world. And what in the book, what she points out is that in the Roman usage, and it actually existed even earlier in Hellenistic times, there were Greek teachers of the same techniques. There was the memory of the loci, the places, or more commonly referred to in our usage as memory palaces. It's a mnemonic device, a memory device that uses visualizations of familiar spatial environments in order to enhance recall. So when desiring to remember a set of items, the subject walks through these loci in their imagination and commits an item to each one by forming an image between the item and any feature of that locus. So you might use the basilica in your town, the Church of St. Francis, if you're in Assisi, which has many side altars and countless artworks, giottos, and you might hang ideas on ledges underneath or on the side of one of the altars or underneath one of the giottos. You can say, I'm going to associate this idea with that place. And so by doing that, you form a stronger bond, and it's a memory device. And so you may not remember natively the thing you want to remember, but you never would forget that place in the organizational scaffolding that is the cathedral. So of course you remember every brick around the altar. Of course you remember every ledge in the sacristy. Now you form the bond with that ledge or that cruet or whatever it is, whatever that little object is, that thing, that place with the thing you really ultimately want to remember now. And maybe because it sounds like the name of that thing, or it sounds like the name of that place, but you've now attached, you have hyperlinked, using our internet terminology, you've hyperlinked a place that you know very well with an idea that you don't know as well, so that you will now be able to easily recall that idea. Cicero talks about the techniques in his Rhetorica ad Herennium and the De Oratoria. Quintilian does this in the Instituto Oratoria. They're rediscovered and highly valued by the humanists, these texts on memory. Now, these techniques existed in the Middle Ages. They were just updated but in the Renaissance for application in the political environments they found themselves in. There's a great mystic, Spanish mystic of the 13th and early 14th century, Ramon Llull, a logician, a philosopher, a mystic. He developed a strategy for memorization and analysis based on combinations. So he develops this wheel of rotating concentric circles that he could align to show all possible truths about a subject. And it's a very arcane methodology that he develops. But much centuries later, in the 16th century, the great Neapolitan monk and occultist and sort of quasi-philosopher Giordano Bruno becomes famous for spectacular feats of memory because he develops a technique that combines Llull's wheel with astrology and the zodiac as a mnemonic. So here is the memory wheel, and he uses this to associate ideas. This is his loci, if you will. And he uses this, he knows this wheel inside and out. And then when he wants to memorize something, he associates the bits that he wants to remember with parts of the wheel, and he's got it down. This is a statue of Bruno that you can see in the Campo dei Fiori in Rome. That was erected, I believe, in the 19th century. He was burned as a heretic, but he later became a symbol of intellectual freedom in the 19th century. And the figures that idolized him thought that he was victimized by the church. So he's the statue in the Campo dei Fiori. He's got a scowl. You can't quite see it here. He's got the scowl on his face, and they pointed the statue directly towards the Vatican in Rome, which is like 2 miles away, but they don't care. Let him growl at the Vatican from the Campo dei Fiori. Anyhow, Bruno went around Europe with parlor tricks like memorizing entire books of the Old Testament in Hebrew, and then telling people, I can teach you this method for money, but getting himself into trouble with the church along the way. And it was a technique. There's still modern practitioners of all these techniques. There's a contest every year that is held in various places. It's like a conference. People go to Vegas or whatever, and they show off their memory techniques. There was a famous New York Knicks basketball player named Jerry Lucas, who went on the Johnny Carson show back around 1970 and had memorized the Manhattan phone book at the time. And you could give him a number and he'd tell you whose number it was, or you could give him a name and he would rattle off the number. And as he said, I don't even have a good memory, but you just learn all these tricks. Anyhow, memory was important. Guarino's innovations, however, in writing were the notebook techniques. And remember, I talked about the impact of notebook techniques on and letter writing, on the development of commercial literacy in the Renaissance period. Students were to keep personal notebooks of the hits from their reading, the things as they read the classics that really struck them as useful and quotable and good stylistic examples. And they were encouraged to have collaborative study partners to help with the notebooks. They were encouraged to write literary exercises in the forms of letters about their reading, which they could discuss afterwards. Sounds like a modern lit class. A cultural byproduct of an education in classical literature was a value system that tilted more secular in tone and was all the more useful to the social and political realities of early modern Italy, which is what I talked about last week. Vittorino's innovations at La Cosa Giocosa, a school could be an inviting place. He put his school in garden surroundings, surrounded by beautiful images. Sounds like the Little Red Schoolhouse, huh? Learning should be pleasant and not onerous. It should be interspersed with physical exercise and play. Moral education is essential. And so history was seen by the Romans and by these Renaissance figures as a source book of moral examples, historicae. You love to read about the lives of great historical men so that you had something to emulate. The goal of education was to create the best, most complete people, the universal man, and so must adapt to the child's needs and abilities. And I mentioned in this box at the bottom, Renaissance humanism is traditionally associated with the invention of individualism. It was actually a reawakening of a classical, particularly Stoic mentality, that individualism. It wasn't anything new as such. And so we arrive at some images of education. So this fresco by Vincenzo Foppa, mid-15th century, of the young Cicero reading as the model of a child in an idealized setting. And is he thinking of La Giocosa, I wonder, and as he paints this? And in this painting on the right, which comes, it's actually a manuscript design, it comes from a grammar book owned by Massimiliano Sforza and his teacher, John Antonio Secco. And it's a grammar book written for the Sforza family in the 15th century. And true to Renaissance sensibilities, it's open, it's light. The teacher is honored. He's a great teacher. He's wearing a laurel wreath, a classical reference. They are working from common texts. There's the court dwarf in the foreground. Pets are allowed for the younger child. You can tell the age of people by the relative sizes. Someone's doing some kind of little, it looks like what is he doing? Some kind of little experiment or something. And somebody's fallen asleep. All allowed. It's what young people are about in the educational realm. Humanists, of course, became the celebrated subjects of artists. They start appearing in paintings. So here you see their universal interest. You have globes. It's the age of exploration on the hook. This is Vasari in the mid-16th century. And it's a collection of 6 famous Tuscan poets. Italian has been invented. We have Dante Alighieri and Giovanni Boccaccio and Petrarca, and Cino da Pistoia, Guitone d'Arezzo, Guido Cavalcante. And here's a Luca Signorelli portrait of Dante, and again, the laurel wreath, the Roman reference. And here he is, he's got his Virgil on one side that he's referencing, and he's creating his own Paradiso or Inferno in his study as he works. And since I mentioned him earlier as a major humanist, even though this slide, because it talks about patronage, and I probably deserves a place in one of the later sessions where I talk about that directly head on. Aeneas Silvio Piccolomini, Pope Pius II, with the classical first name Aeneas, the founder of Rome, the citizen of Troy who makes his way, bounces off North Africa and winds up the founder of Rome, was a humanist, a scholar, an autobiographer, the only pope, I think, who ever wrote a significant autobiography, and Renaissance patron. And his greatest act of patronage is the small jewel city or large town, depending on how you think of it, of Pienza. He commissioned Florentine architect Bernardo Rossellino. Bernardo had a different last name, but he was called the Redhead, so he's Rossellino, to design and rebuild the core of Pienza. It's in the province of Siena in Tuscany, which was the family seat of the Piccolomini family, which was an old titled family, even though he was raised without money, but sort of by becoming Pope, wound up restoring the family fortune. And this town is a masterpiece of Renaissance style. And it's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And if we look a little more closely, this is the central piazza with this very elegant Renaissance Romanesque church in the center of the piazza. And this is the Piazza Piccolomini for his stays up in the region when he would visit from Rome, and Piccolomini Gardens near the Palazzo. And you look out the city, as many Tuscan cities are on a height, and you look out at the Val d'Orcia in the distance. And it's one of those glorious gems that you wander into when you're in Tuscany and wind up only going to have a nice lunch and then becoming totally intrigued by the place you found yourself in, as happens. And study, the idea of study and education as a curated art and work of art. And so two images here. The one on the left is the studiolo. It's the little study, if you will, of Federico da Montefeltro from Gubbio. So he was the Duke of Urbino, and who controlled Gubbio simultaneously. And he built one of these studiolos in each of his two palaces. So there's one that was built in Gubbio. That's this one, which is at the Metropolitan Museum. If you go back towards, on the main floor, back towards the medieval collection and sort of hang a right, ask somebody there because it's a little side room. It's one of my favorite things in the museum. And we're going to look very closely at the way these things were constructed. This is all intarsia. All of these 3D images of objects and works are done, and doors that are open and half open perspectives are done in pieces of wood and inlaid wood. And it's just an astonishing artwork. I mean, you get instruments and their shadows against the wall. I mean, it's just astonishing. And the whole 3D vision of it. And the one in Urbino, you have windows that look to the outside that are not really windows. Obviously, the scenes extend into the distance. And here is the Duke himself, Federico da Montefeltro, who was educated in the school of Vittorino. And he is a condottiero. He is a mercenary general. So here you have a man of power, a man of culture, a man of education, a man with artistic sensibilities. He is the Renaissance man with his son in a painting by Pedro Berruguete. And you can find it all. It's the image of what one desires to be. A man of balance who happens to also be a man of war in this case. And so it's kind of a juxtaposition that the Christian medieval world would never have lionized. But here in this world, it's a Roman model. You remember when a Roman general was given, and remember, a Roman general had great successes, was allegedly doing it for the city, not for his own self-glory. So during the triumph that he might be awarded after his successful campaign, come back to Rome, and his chariot would process with the objects that were taken from the enemy, and with his prisoners. He'd process down the Via Sacra in the Roman Forum, and in the back of the chariot there would be a slave who would hold up a skull, and that was under a cloth, and show him the skull and whisper in his ear, sic transit gloria mundi. Just remember, lest you become too full of yourself, be measured. Or this is what you will become. We are all men. Don't become too big for your boots. And this was up until the mid-20th century. In every papal procession for a newly elected pope, who would be carried around Rome in a sedan chair, there would be a deacon holding a skull under a pall, a silk cloth or a satin cloth, and who would say, Beatissime Pater, sic transit gloria mundi, just the same thing that was whispered in the ears of the Roman general, the imperator. And here you had the image of not the savage warlike chieftain, but the noble warrior who is measured by his education and his art and his self-organization. Here is the stoic pinnacle of the ideal man or person. Anyhow, to end with a couple of images to show how classical subjects were now being introduced alongside of religious subjects and this rediscovered this revival of the classical tradition. It's not just literary. So here we have Botticelli's, the famous Venus on the half shell, as they used to call it. And scholars have explained the image as perhaps being inspired by a Homeric hymn from the ancient world that was published by a Greek translator at the Florentine court. And the Homeric hymn says, "Of august gold-wreathed and beautiful Aphrodite, Venus, I shall sing to whose domain belong the battlements of all sea-loved Cyprus, where blown by the moist breath of Zephyros the wind, she was carried over the waves of the resounding sea on soft foam. The gold-filleted Hore, there's Hore, happily welcomed her and clothed her with heavenly raiment." And well, how does Botticelli come by the reference? Well, he's at the Florentine court. In the period of the Medici, the Florentine court had established a Neoplatonic academy for the new translations of Plato and other Greek sources. And any intellectual, and Botticelli as an artist is admitted into the circle, any intellectual would have known that these were the images that were being discussed. This was the world that was constituting the new sense of taste. And he painted directly to what was in the air, what was in this new sensibility. And so we wind up with the birth of Venus, or we wind up with La Primavera from the same period. And so springtime is idealized. I tried to find what we know who many of these characters are, and I'll explain them in a second, in the painting. And I was trying to find an explanation for what's the narrative that unites them all in this scene. And I'm sure there's a Neoplatonic narrative that underlies the whole thing. We do have Zephyrus, the wind, who kidnaps the nymph Chloris and then loves her and transforms her into the goddess of spring. So here is Chloris being kidnapped, and here's Chloris as the goddess. So there's a story here. There's a transformation here that probably has a Neoplatonic idealization behind it. There's Cupid, or Eros, if you will, and Venus, or Aphrodite in the Greek. And she is this fertile mother of spring, looking out at us and overlooking the three graces. And Mercury, the god Mercury, how this all fits into a narrative story. There seems to be great debate about, and I didn't find a good explanation anywhere. There are some 500 identified plant species that are in this painting. And if I go, if I go back and do a close-up, so we see every kind of fruit and every kind of leaf and every kind of grass and every kind of fern and what have you. And it's interesting that both Venus and the goddess of spring are looking out at us and not at one another. Anyhow, and the final slide, just to give the sense that of how classically minded the students of the new program were. So equestrian statues abound. So here is a Roman one, and it's the famous one of Marcus Aurelius. And here is an equally famous one of Colleone, one of the grand generals of the internecine wars of the Italian city-states. So this is by Verrocchio. This is a bronze by Verrocchio in the late 15th century with that the fierce face of the condottiero, and in effect creating a more imposing and menacing figure than even both the horse and the man, than even Marcus Aurelius in the ancient world. And so he sort of outdid his models. So I am going to, with that, that's the last slide. I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to remove the pin. And if there are questions, observations, or comments, feel free. But that's it for today. Nobody, huh? You were also chatty last week. Anyhow.
Well, I found this very fascinating and very deep. Halfway through, I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to have to go through the slides when he says, just because there's such an accumulation of stuff there, and I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything.
Just as I post the taping of this, the recording of this, I also will send you, of course, the accumulated. What I always do is when I send the PDF of the slide deck, I always send it accumulated from all the classes we've done. So the one I'll send in a day or two will be sessions 1 and 2. So you can go back over the whole thing.
Yeah, I just found this extremely deep. And in my mind, I'm going back and forth between what I already know and what, especially the art. And not that I'm an expert in that, but there are some of the Renaissance art I just recognize from long-term cultural association. So the challenge to me was the going back and forth and trying to knit it all together. Does that make sense?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
That the knitting together is the memory challenge. As
good point. Yeah.
That's
at one point when you were talking about the mnemonics, I was thinking of, it made me think of the movie Spellbound. Doesn't Hitchcock play with some of that mnemonic legend, all those mnemonic devices and legends in that movie?
I don't remember the movie that well.
Oh, it's Ingrid Bergman and Gregory Peck, and she's a therapist, and he's a traumatized individual, and she's trying to get him to remember. And I think he has, what do you call it, amnesia. And so there's a lot of these techniques, and Hitchcock loves, I think, in that movie, playing with the imagery that evokes.
Well, and do you remember using little mnemonics like when you studied science in high school and you had to remember?
Well, I do, and but one of the things you were talking about was the practice of keeping notebooks and writing letters. That has always been one of my, I mean, even now when I'm reading something that, that I find deep or interesting, I still take notes and write down things that speak to me, because that's how again, that knitting in of whatever you're accumulating, still knitting it into what you already have stored up there.
Jeff just reminded us of every good boy does fine. That's right. Or what was the one from biology? Sam Cardfur, all the life signs.
I don't even know that.
Yeah. But remember, now we have smartphones and Google in our pockets. And so we've gotten away from having to file stuff in places either by writing them down or by associating them with well-known things.
Yeah, that's why I've been resistant to Google.
Yeah, for memory purposes.
Right, right.
Our memories are probably rotting on the vine.
Well, but that to me, that's a good reason to resist it. I mean, here's my rationale is like, oh, I can stop having to remember precise dates, and I can remember the events and how they work together, because I can always look up the number on Google. But I'm not going to, the content seems like more important to me, but I don't know if that's a rationalization or not.
Well, there you go.
Well,
Anyhow,
Lou, as you get older, you can hear something, but if you don't write it down, you are not going to remember it.
Exactly. That's what I find. There's something about the connection of the writing implement and the hand and the arm and the brain that is elemental, I think.
It's a reinforcement.
Mm-hmm.
I always found, and it must have had something to do with delivering lectures. When I wanted to remember something, I had to be able to explain it back to myself as if I were in front of a group.
Yep. And outlines always worked on that for me.
And so by elaborating the explanation, I was reinforcing the memory of it. So of course, the best activity for a student is to believe that they are the teacher and have to deliver the lecture themselves. And so if you subject yourself to that discipline, you wind up with a knowledge of the subject.
That's kind of necessary do they still do essay tests? I mean, it seems like throughout college, most of my exams were essay exams, but you kind of have to be able to do that, right? You have to be able to be the teacher in order to write a good essay.
Yeah, you would hope, but I'm not so sure that they do that much.
Anyhow, do they still even do those now?
I don't really know. Having
in the age of AI, who knows?
Having not been on the scene. Anyhow, gang, this time next week, the next couple sessions are going to be very different and very interesting, if I say so myself. Anyhow,
this one was pretty good, Lou. Don't underrate this one.
Okay, take care.
Thank you, Lou.
Blessings. Have a great week, everyone. Bye, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Lou.